The moment Nora Callahan stepped off the stagecoach and planted both boots in the red dust of Redrock, Texas, she knew that every man within 100 yards was looking at her like she was something other than what she actually was, which was a woman who had traveled 900 miles to do a job and had no patience left for anything else. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Redrock sat at the edge of the Edwards Plateau like a knuckle pressed against the earth, stubborn and sun-baked, full of cattle ranchers and saddle-worn cowboys who drove longhorns up to the rail lines and spent their wages on whiskey and card games before doing it all over again. The town had exactly one general store, one saloon, one church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a desperate shortage of teachers willing to come this far south for this little pay. Nora was 24 years old, and she had a teaching certificate from St. Catherine's College in San Antonio, a carpetbag full of McGuffey readers and arithmetic primers, and a temper that she kept on a very short leash most days, and released without apology on the days when she could not manage it. She had also, somewhere between her mother's death and her father's remarriage, and 3 years of teaching ungrateful children in a cramped schoolroom in Austin, developed an iron determination never to let a man or anything else pull her off course again. She was here to teach. Full stop. The stagecoach driver handed her bag down and tipped his hat, and she thanked him crisply and turned to look at the town. It was not impressive. The main street was a long corridor of weathered buildings with their paint long since surrendered to the sun, a water trough down the center, and horses hitched in various states of patience and impatience along the rails. There was a banner strung between 2 posts above the general store that read "Welcome to Redrock," though the letters had faded to near ghost, as if even the welcome had given up. A man was already walking toward her. He was tall, somewhere around 30 from the look of him, with dark hair and the kind of tan that comes not from leisure, but from years of working under an unsparing sky. He wore a plain dark vest over a work shirt, boots that were clean but not new, and a hat that had seen genuine use. He carried himself with a quiet ease that was not swagger but something more settled than that, like a man who had made his peace with the earth beneath him. There was a star pinned to his vest that caught the afternoon light. He stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat, holding it at his side. "Miss Callahan," he said. "That is correct," she said, adjusting the carpetbag on her arm. "Am Cole Harding," he said. "Sheriff here in Redrock. The school board asked me to meet you and see you settled at the boarding house. Mrs. Pettifer runs it. She is a good woman and she will have a room ready for you." "That is very kind," Nora said. "Appreciate the welcome. But I want to make something clear straight from the outset, Sheriff, because have found it saves a great deal of misunderstanding down the road." He looked at her with a steady, dark gaze that neither hurried nor retreated. "Came here to work," she said, "not to wed. Am aware of how towns like this sometimes view a young, single woman as an opportunity or an acquisition. Am neither. Am a schoolteacher, and that is the whole of it." There was a beat of silence. "Yes, ma'am," Cole Harding said, and then he waited, unhurried, hat in hand, with the afternoon sun falling across the side of his face, and something in the way he simply stood there, not embarrassed, not offended, not calculating, just present and patient, made Nora feel, very briefly, like she had perhaps fired a shot at a man who had not been drawing his weapon. She told herself it did not matter. She followed him to the boarding house. Mrs. Pettifer was a brisk, warm woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a laugh that came easily and often. She had Nora's room ready just as promised, a small but clean space with a good window overlooking the side yard where 2 pecan trees threw shade in the late afternoon, a writing desk, a bed with a proper quilt, and a washstand. It was more than Nora had expected. "I heard you were coming for weeks," Mrs. Pettifer said, setting a pitcher of water on the washstand. "The whole town has. We have not had a teacher in going on 8 months, not since old Mr. Briggs packed up and went back to Missouri. The children are running half wild. "I will take care of that," Nora said, and meant it without cruelty, only conviction. Mrs. Pettifer smiled at her in a way that suggested she believed it. "Supper is at 6. Cole usually eats here on Tuesdays and Thursdays since his own place is across town. Hope that will not be a bother." "Why would it be a bother?" Nora said. "He is a man who eats supper. That is not remarkable." Mrs. Pettifer looked like she was trying not to smile wider than was polite. "Of course," she said. The schoolhouse was a square wooden building on the north edge of town, and when Nora walked through its door the following morning, she understood at once why Mr. Briggs had left. The desks were in a state of cheerful disorder. The blackboard had a crack running diagonally across its face. The primer books were a generation out of date and missing half their pages, and there was, inexplicably, a live chicken under the teacher's desk. Nora removed the chicken. She rearranged the desks. She wrote her name on the cracked blackboard in firm, clear letters, Miss N. Callahan. She opened the front door and waited. They came in ones and twos, 18 children between the ages of 6 and 14, watching her with the particular wariness of people who had been without supervision long enough to feel its absence as a kind of freedom they were not sure they wanted to give back. The older boys tested her with slow movements and sidelong looks. The younger children were simply curious. Nora taught them all morning with brisk efficiency and quiet authority, and by noon she had established two things, which children could already read and which needed to start from the very beginning, and that her authority in this room was not going to be a matter of debate. She was firm without being cold, and she had a gift for explaining things in ways that made difficult ideas feel like puzzles rather than burdens. By the end of the first day, she had 3 of the older boys genuinely engaged in a problem of long division, and a girl named Lucy Whitmore reading aloud from a primer with growing confidence and delight. Walking home in the cooling afternoon, Nora felt something loosen inside her chest, something that had been tight for a long time. This was what she was meant for. This, right here. Cole Harding was at supper that Tuesday just as Mrs. Pettifer had said, seated across the table from the other boarder, a traveling dentist named Mr. Fulton, who was staying for 2 weeks to work through the considerable dental needs of Redrock's population. Cole stood when Nora came in and sat back down when she sat, and he served her the bread basket before serving himself, and they had a perfectly ordinary conversation about the town and the school and the weather, and he did not once reference their exchange at the stagecoach or look at her in a way that felt like anything other than ordinary respect. Nora found this, privately, a little unusual. Men tended to do one of two things when she announced herself the way she had. They either sulked or they overcorrected into exaggerated indifference to make a point. Cole Harding did neither. He talked to her the way a person talks to another person whose company they find reasonable and whose time they consider worth nothing more or less than their own. She mentioned the cracked blackboard at supper, saying that she would need to ask the school board about a replacement. "Can take a look at it," he said. "Sometimes a crack like that is more surface than structural. If it is only the slate layer, there is a way to fill it that holds well enough." "Do you know about blackboard repair?" she said, and she did not mean it as a skeptical question, just a genuine one. "I know about most things that break in this town," he said simply. "It comes with the job." The next afternoon he appeared at the schoolhouse after the children had gone, carrying a small tin of compound that looked like plaster and a set of tools she did not know the names of. He examined the crack, worked on it for about an hour with careful, methodical attention, and when he was done it was not invisible, but it was smooth and sealed and would not spread further. "That should hold," he said, packing up his tools. "Thank you," Nora said. She was grading papers at the desk and she looked up at him over the stack. "That was genuinely helpful. Appreciate it." "You are welcome, Miss Callahan," he said, and he went. He did not linger. He did not find a reason to stay. He just went, and she watched the door close behind him and then looked back at her papers and found, irritatingly, that she had lost her place in the line of arithmetic answers she had been checking. April stretched into May and May into June, and Nora sank herself into the rhythms of the school and the town with the deep satisfaction of work that matters done well. She learned the children's names and then their natures, which was a slower and more important lesson. She learned that Lucy Whitmore's family was struggling since her father's injury last year left the ranch understaffed, and that Billy Oakes, who disrupted lessons twice a week, did so because he was frightened and had decided that being difficult was better than being found out as someone who could not read. She addressed both problems with quiet practicality. She recommended Lucy for a paid tutoring position helping a neighbor's younger children on Saturday mornings. She kept Billy after class not to punish him, but to simply read with him, one page at a time, without spectators. She also learned the town, which was more complicated than it looked from a stagecoach window. There were tensions here, layered and old, between the larger ranching operations and the small farmers who had been moving into the territory in recent years. The big ranches wanted open range and resented the fences. The farmers needed the fences to protect their crops and animals. The arguments happened in the saloon and at the water troughs and once, memorably, in the middle of Main Street, and it always came back to Cole Harding to stand between them and remind both sides that he had a jail and would use it without preference. She watched him do this once from the doorway of the general store. A rancher named Beaumont, wide and red-faced, was nose-to-nose with a younger farmer whose name she later learned was Del Sorrento, and the language was deteriorating into the kind that precedes violence. Cole stepped between them with unhurried authority, said something quiet that she could not hear, and within 5 minutes both men had backed down and gone their separate ways. He did not raise his voice once. She asked Mrs. Pettifer about him that evening, in the casual way one asks about a neighbor. Mrs. Pettifer settled into her rocking chair and told her, in the comfortable way of a woman who knows a story worth telling, that Cole Harding had come to Redrock 4 years ago. He had been a rancher's hand before that, up in the panhandle, working cattle for going on a decade from the age of 18. His father had died when he was young, leaving his mother and 2 younger sisters, and Cole had gone to work to keep them fed while his mother took in laundry and sewing. By the time his sisters were grown and his mother remarried to a good man in Abilene, Cole was 28 years old and had discovered, somewhere in those years of hard work and straight dealing, that he had a gift for calming situations that wanted to become disasters. The previous sheriff of Redrock had offered him the deputy position and Cole had taken it, and when the previous sheriff retired the following year, the town had made Cole the offer and he had accepted it with the same uncomplicated directness he brought to most things. "Has he ever been married?" Nora asked, aiming for casual and possibly achieving it. "No," Mrs. Pettifer said. "There was a woman about 2 years ago, a merchant's daughter from Abilene. They wrote letters for some time. She came to visit and decided Redrock was too small and too far from everything she wanted. She went back north. Cole took it quietly and went back to work." Nora looked at her teacup. "That must have been difficult for him." "He did not say much about it," Mrs. Pettifer said. "Cole never says much about things that hurt him. He just works through them." Nora recognized that. She recognized it because she did the same thing. It was the strategy of someone who has learned early that feelings, left to expand without containment, take up too much room in a life that has necessary work to do. The spring brought a particular beauty to the Texas Hill Country that Nora had not been prepared for. She had grown up in San Antonio, which was beautiful in a different way, more settled and shaded, but out here the land opened up in a way that felt almost aggressive in its scale, rolling limestone hills covered in wildflowers in May, the blue of the sky so deep and wide it felt like a physical weight, the cedar and live oak throwing their irregular shade across the red earth. She began taking long walks on Sunday mornings after church, going out along the creek road and then up into the hills behind the town, where the views opened to the south, and you could see the country spreading out for miles. One Sunday in late May, she came around a bend in the trail and nearly walked directly into Cole Harding, who was coming down from the other direction on a gray horse that he had apparently left tied to a cedar tree while he sat on a limestone outcropping and looked at the view. He stood up when he saw her, and she stopped, and for a moment there was just the sound of the wind in the cedar branches and the distant calling of a meadowlark somewhere in the grass. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Miss Callahan," he said. "I did not expect company up here." "Neither did I," she said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was the kind that needs filling or it will tip into awkward territory. "It is a remarkable view," she said, walking forward to stand at the edge of the outcropping where he had been sitting. "It is," he said. He had not put his hat back on and his dark hair was slightly disordered by the wind. He looked younger this way, or perhaps more truthful, like the official version of himself that wore the star and kept the piece had been temporarily set aside. "Do you come up here often?" she asked. "Sunday mornings," he said, "when nothing needs immediate attending." "So do I," she said, "or I have been the last month." "Did not know I was on someone's regular route." "It is not my route by any claim," he said. "You are as welcome here as I am." They stood together for a little while and looked at the country below. It was easier than she would have expected, standing next to him in silence. He did not fill the quiet with unnecessary sound the way some men did, the way men did when they were uncomfortable or trying to impress or both. He simply stood there, the wind moving across the hill, and seemed to find the view as sufficient reason for being as she did. "The children are making real progress," she said eventually, because it was true and because it was the kind of thing she thought about on her Sunday walks. "Billy Oakes read an entire page aloud yesterday without stopping." He did not even seem to notice how far he had gone until he reached the end. Cole turned to look at her with a slight shift in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "Billy Oakes has not been in any trouble for 6 weeks," he said. "That is significant. Before you came, he was in the saloon yard twice throwing rocks at the windows." "He was frightened," Nora said. "I know," Cole said. She looked at him. "Most people attributed it to bad character." "Most people," he said carefully, "do not always look at where a thing comes from." She studied his profile as he looked back at the view, the line of his jaw, the steadiness of his eyes. There was something here that she kept encountering in him and could not easily name. It was not simply kindness, though he was kind. It was a kind of thoroughness in his attention, a refusal to settle for the surface explanation of people and situations when the real one was available if you were willing to look. She went home eventually, and he went wherever he was going, and the Sunday hills became a thing they shared without planning to, encountering each other 3 or 4 Sundays running through June and early July, sometimes talking for 20 minutes and sometimes barely at all. And Nora found herself on those mornings putting on her better walking dress, and then telling herself it was simply because the fresh air warranted it. It was in the second week of July that things began to shift in ways that went beyond the easy Sunday hill country. The trouble came from the ranch. Not from Beaumont, who had settled into a simmering but manageable antagonism toward the farming community, but from a man named Garrett Wade, who had ridden into Redrock in late June as the new foreman of the Beaumont operation, and who was, in Nora's estimation within the first hour of meeting him, exactly the kind of man who causes problems not out of malice specifically, but out of a complete inability to conceive of any interest other than his own. Wade took an immediate and demonstrative interest in Nora that she found neither flattering nor manageable. He arrived at the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon on a pretense about needing the school calendar for some reason he never properly articulated, and he leaned against the doorframe of her classroom and paid her compliments in the manner of a man who expects compliments to function as currency, exchanged for something he has decided he wants. Nora handled it with practiced economy. She thanked him for his time, indicated that she was very busy, and showed him the door without flourish or apology. He came back Thursday. She handled it again. He came back the following Monday with a bunch of wildflowers, and she told him, without any softening at all, that she did not accept gifts from men she had no intention of encouraging, and that she would appreciate it if he directed his attention elsewhere. He did not, precisely, take this well. He did not do anything overtly threatening, but he began loitering near the schoolhouse at the end of the school day, and at the general store when she came in for her weekly supplies, and once at the church after the Sunday service in a way that made Mrs. Pettifer's eyes narrow significantly. On a Wednesday evening in mid-July, Cole stopped by the schoolhouse on his evening rounds and found Nora still there, sitting at her desk in the dimming light with her hands folded on the surface in a posture that was not her usual working posture. "Is something wrong?" he said from the doorway, because he was a man who noticed things. She considered not telling him. She considered telling him it was nothing. She considered that both of these responses would be a form of dishonesty that she had never much tolerated in herself. "Garrett Wade," she said. Cole came into the room. He sat down in one of the student chairs, which was too small for him, and he looked at her across the row of desks with quiet attention. She told him the whole of it without editorializing, the visits, the flowers, the lurking. Cole listened without interrupting, his face holding that careful stillness that she had come to associate with him working something through. "I can speak with him," he said when she had finished. "I do not want you to fight my battles," she said immediately. "I know," he said. "This is not about fighting your battle. Lurking around a schoolhouse and making a woman feel surveilled is a matter for the law. That is my business regardless." She looked at him. "You are not going to tell me I should take it as a compliment or that he probably does not mean any harm?" "No," he said, and his voice was level and certain. "I'm not going to say either of those things. You told him clearly that you were not interested. He does not get to decide that the telling was inadequate." The silence that followed felt different from other silences. There was something in it that she had not expected, a kind of recognition, like finding a word for something you had been carrying without a name. "Thank you," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was that phrase again, the one he had said on the first day. But now it sounded different, or perhaps she was hearing it differently, with less formality in it and more of something else, something that felt like a form of steadiness offered without condition. He spoke with Garrett Wade the following morning. She did not know exactly what was said, but it was brief and apparently sufficient. Wade gave her a wide berth after that, and the lurking stopped, and in 2 weeks he had apparently found an opportunity with a widow over in the neighboring county, and transferred his attention there without apparent grief. The summer burned hot and deep into the Texas earth, and Nora taught through it, keeping the schoolroom windows open for whatever breath of air the day was willing to provide, teaching history and arithmetic and reading and writing with the same patient, driving conviction she had brought since the first day. She also began a small lending library out of her own collection of books, supplemented by a shipment of donated volumes that she had written to request from the San Antonio Public Library, with a letter that apparently moved the librarian enough that the response contained 32 volumes and a note wishing her success. The library became a thing of significance in the town, in a way she had not predicted. Adults began coming in after school hours to borrow books, quietly and a little self-consciously at first, and then with more ease as it became clear that borrowing a book from the schoolteacher was not an occasion for judgment. Del Sorrento, the young farmer she had seen in the standoff with Beaumont, borrowed a book on irrigation techniques and then another on seed cultivation, and then, tentatively, A novel that he returned with the confession that he had not read a novel in 4 years and had forgotten how much a good story could do for a person. She told Cole about the library project one Sunday in late July when they had fallen into their now customary habit of walking parts of the hill trail together. He had told her, some weeks prior, that he had started the walk at the bottom instead of the top, and this meant they now encountered each other within the first 10 minutes and simply continued together for however long their separate intentions for the day allowed. People are hungry for it, she said, meaning the books, the reading, the connection to the wider world. They just need the door to be open and the invitation to be clear. You make the invitation clear, he said. I try, she said. He looked at her sideways in the way he sometimes did, not obviously, just a brief shift of his gaze before returning it to the trail ahead. You are very good at this, he said. At the teaching, and at the other parts too. What other parts? The seeing people, he said. Really seeing what they need rather than what they present. She was quiet for a moment. The morning light was coming through the cedars in long, angled bars, and a mockingbird was doing its wild catalog somewhere above them. My mother was good at it, she said. Better than I am. I learned from watching her. She passed, he said. It was not intrusive, just a careful acknowledgement. 3 years ago, Nora said. Fever, it was quick, which people kept telling me was a mercy, and I kept telling myself they were right until eventually I actually believed it. I am sorry, he said, with the particular weight of someone who means the words. Your father died young, she said. She had not meant to say it quite so directly, and then decided that she had meant to, actually, because they had been talking around the edges of each other's histories for weeks, and it was beginning to feel like a willful omission. He did not seem startled. I was 13, he said. Fall from a horse, he was gone by morning. That shapes a person, she said. It does, he agreed. I do not think I minded the work afterward. The working for the family. Think it gave me something to do with the grief that might otherwise have been unbearable. Purpose is useful that way. She stopped on the trail and looked at him, and he stopped too, and they were standing in a band of morning light with the Texas hill country spreading out below and around them, and she realized with a clarity that was almost physical in its certainty that she had been falling for this man for months, quietly and without fanfare. The way a river changes its course, not all at once but over time, eroding the ground between what was and what wants to be. She also realized in the same moment that she was terrified of it. She did not say any of this. She said, we should probably keep walking, and he said, yes, ma'am, and they walked on, and the words did not come back to the surface for another 2 weeks, but they were there beneath everything, present and patient. In early August, a crisis arrived from an unexpected direction. A note came from San Antonio, delivered by the monthly mail rider, written in a hand she recognized as her stepmother's. Her father had had a significant fall. He was in recovery, the note said, but the house required more management than her stepmother could provide alone. The implication, dense and freighted, was that Nora should come home. She read the letter at her desk after school and sat very still for a long time. She was not close with her stepmother, a decent but careful woman named Harriet who had come into her father's life 2 years after her mother's death, and who had never managed to be anything but slightly awkward with her husband's elder daughter, all the more so because Nora was so clearly her mother's daughter. Her father she loved, deeply and without complication, the way you love a person who has been fundamentally good to you over a whole life. He was 62 and had fallen off a ladder while attempting, apparently, to repair a section of roof that Nora was quite certain he should have hired someone else to repair. But the school, the children, the library, the blackboard with its sealed crack, and the reader she was building for Billy Oakes because the published ones did not serve him well enough. The women who came in for books on Wednesday afternoons, the whole living, breathing, growing organism of what she was building here. She went to supper that evening in a state of interior tension that she apparently could not hide as well as she thought, because Mrs. Pettifer looked at her with concern throughout the meal and offered her a second helping of pie in the careful way one offers comfort without naming the need for it. Cole was there, and he looked at her once across the table with a question in his expression that he did not ask aloud. After supper, when Mr. Fulton the dentist had gone up to his room and Mrs. Pettifer was in the kitchen, Cole said quietly, "Do you want to sit on the porch for a while?" The porch of the boarding house faced west, and in the evenings caught a breeze that moved through the pecan trees and made the heat of the day feel temporarily like a story someone was telling about somewhere else. Nora sat in the wooden chair that was becoming habitual for her, and Cole sat on the porch railing with his hat in his hands, and she told him about the letter. He listened all the way through. "What do you want to do?" he said when she was done. "I want to stay here," she said, and the fierceness in her own voice surprised her a little. "This is my work, this is my actual life, what I have built here, and I know that sounds cold when my father is injured." "It does not sound cold," he said. "It sounds like someone who has worked very hard for something and is afraid of losing it." "But he is my father," she said. "He is," Cole said, "and you love him." "But loving someone does not automatically mean you must sacrifice everything you are to prove it." She looked at him. "You sound like you have thought about this." "Have had versions of this choice," he said. "Between the obligation owed my family and the life I was trying to build for myself, there is not a clean answer. There is only the answer that you can live with honestly." "What did you do?" she asked. "I went home when I was needed," he said, "and I stayed away when staying away was the harder and more right thing. It was different each time." She was quiet, watching the pecan trees move in the evening breeze, the last light fading in the west in long copper bands. "I'm going to write my father a letter," she said finally, "and I'm going to ask him honestly whether he needs me there or whether he needs me to be his daughter from here and send what I can." "That sounds right," Cole said. "And if he needs me there, I will go," she said, the words costing her something. "You will come back," he said. Simply as a fact. She looked at him and the porch and the evening light and the way he sat on that railing holding his hat with a steadiness that was not born of indifference but of genuine belief. "You think so?" she said. "Think you built something here," he said, "that belongs to you as much as to them. And I think you are not the kind of woman who walks away from something that belongs to her." She went inside after a while and wrote her father the most honest letter she had ever written him, and she asked him plainly what he needed, and she told him what she was building in Redrock, and she told him she loved him. The answer came back in 3 weeks. Her father had healed better than expected. He was on a walking stick but fully managed, and Harriet had engaged a woman from the neighborhood to help with the house, and he was proud of her, was what he wrote, and she should stay in her school and teach those Texas children everything she knew, and he would write to her every month and she should write back. She read that letter sitting in her chair on the boarding house porch in the golden afternoon, and she pressed it against her chest and felt the relief move through her like water. She told Cole the next Sunday on the hill and watched his face do that thing it did, that careful, contained brightening that was not quite a smile but was close to one. And she thought, with a sudden and somewhat overwhelming clarity, that she did not want to keep pretending she was not paying close attention to that face. August became September, and September brought the beginning of the fall term with a new student, a girl named Rosario Sorrento, who was Del Sorrento's younger sister, 12 years old and newly arrived from their family's village in Mexico, quiet and watchful, and carrying a tremendous intelligence in her dark eyes that had not yet been given adequate room to move. Nora recognized her within the first day as someone who was going to be extraordinary if given the right conditions, and she made it her particular project that semester to make sure Rosario had those conditions. The language was the barrier, Rosario's English being functional but limited, and Nora had enough Spanish from her San Antonio years to bridge the gap in the beginning. And more importantly, she structured the classroom in ways that Let Rosario demonstrate her intelligence through mathematics and drawing and music before the English was fully there to carry it. The other children, most of them, followed her lead and treated Rosario with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children extend when they are shown clearly by an adult that it is what is expected. There were two boys, older ones, who did not take the lead immediately. Nora handled that with a private conversation and the clear communication that her classroom had one set of standards and they applied to everyone, and she expected those standards to be met, and she had every confidence in their ability to meet them, and she would be very disappointed if they proved her wrong. She was not sure whether it was the compliment embedded in the expectation or the very genuine chill in her voice at the end that carried the day, but they came around. Del Sorrento came to the schoolhouse the following Saturday morning specifically to thank her for taking care of his sister, and he stood in the doorway turning his hat in his hands in the particular way of men who are grateful and do not quite know how to put it. And Nora told him that Rosario was the easiest student she had ever taught because she was so hungry for it. And she watched the pride move across the young farmer's face like sunshine crossing water. September also brought the first community harvest gathering, held on a Saturday evening in the large yard behind the general store. Someone brought a fiddle, and someone else brought a washboard, and there was a great deal of food contributed from every household in the area, and the whole town came, including many of the ranch hands from the outlying operations. And it was one of those evenings where the daily tensions and resentments of a community get put aside for a few hours because the common humanity is simply too present to ignore. Nora wore her green dress, the one she had brought from San Antonio and rarely found occasion for, and she danced with Mr. Fulton the dentist, who turned out to be excellent at a Virginia reel, and with two of the older students' fathers, and with Del Sorrento, who was earnest and enthusiastic if not technically gifted, and with Mrs. Pettifer's husband, who had come in from his farm for the occasion, and who was one of those men who moves through a dance with the settled confidence of someone who learned it young and never forgot. Cole Harding did not dance for most of the evening. He moved through the gathering the way he moved through the town, present and watchful, making sure everything stayed cheerful rather than deteriorating into the kind of cheerful that becomes something else. She saw him speak with Beaumont once, and the conversation seemed amiable enough, which she took as a good sign. She saw him help a child who had fallen and was crying, kneeling down to the child's level in the lamplight with the careful attention he brought to everything. Then the fiddle shifted into something slower, one of those old tunes that everybody knows without being able to say where they learned it, and the crowd rearranged itself into couples, and Nora found herself standing at the edge of the gathering with a cup of lemonade and watching. Cole came to stand beside her. Not in front of her, not with a hand extended and a formal question just beside her, also watching, also with a cup. "You are not dancing," she said. "Neither are you," he said. "Have been dancing all evening," she said. "I know," he said. "I noticed." There was a pause that was weighted in a new way. The fiddle was slow and sweet, and the lantern light was making everything amber and soft. "Would you like to?" he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the dancers, not at her, giving her the option without the pressure of his direct gaze. "Yes," she said. He set down his cup and she set down hers, and he offered his hand and she took it, and they walked to where the other couples were moving in the lantern-lit evening, and then his hand settled at her waist with a careful, respectful steadiness that nonetheless made her very aware of the warmth of it, and her hand settled at his shoulder, and they moved together. He was a good dancer. Not showy, not performative, but solid and present in the way that made it easy to follow, because you always knew where he was and what direction things were going. She supposed that this was true of him in general. They did not talk during the dance. They just danced, and the music was slow enough that it gave space for the various recognitions that had been accumulating over the months to settle into a new arrangement. The harvest lights and the cedar smell of the evening and the warm Texas night and his hand at her waist, steady and sure. And the fact that she was not afraid of this, which was itself startling, because she had been bracing for months against the fear of exactly this kind of thing. The music ended. They stepped back from each other with the particular careful courtesy of people who are trying not to show too much of themselves in a public place. He thanked her for the dance, and she thanked him, and they drifted back to the edges of the gathering. But something had moved, shifted, settled into a new position, and they both knew it. She walked home with Mrs. Pettifer and lay in her bed listening to the pecan trees in the night wind, and thought about the way his hand had felt at her waist, and about the 8 months since she had stepped off that stagecoach and announced herself in the full armor of her intentions, and about how it was possible to be absolutely right about who you were and what you were doing and still be surprised by where it led you. October came in with cooler air from the north, and the children wore their coats in the mornings and discarded them by noon. The reading club that Nora had quietly suggested at the end of September met for the first time at the boarding house on a Thursday evening. 5 women and 2 men, including Del Sorrento, and an older rancher named Amos Pierce, who had surprised everyone including himself by showing up. They read from one of the library novels, took turns reading aloud, and then talked about what they had read, and Nora sat back and moderated and watched with deep satisfaction as people who had few occasions to hear each other's inner lives discovered that their neighbors had them. Cole came to the second meeting of the reading club, which she had not expected, and he was a quiet, careful reader and an equally quiet and careful contributor to the discussion, saying less than most, but with a consistency that showed he had thought about what he was saying before he said it. He and Nora did not sit next to each other, and they did not look at each other more than ordinary conversation required, but Mrs. Pettifer, from her chair by the window, observed them with the expression of a woman who has read enough novels to know what she is looking at. One evening in mid-October, after the reading club had gone and Mrs. Pettifer had tactfully gone up to bed and Mr. Fulton the dentist had finally left Redrock to pursue other towns and other dental needs, Nora and Cole were left in the parlor with the lamp burning low and the night quiet around the house, and she was gathering the books from the table, and he was putting on his hat to leave, and he stopped at the door and turned back. "Nora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss, and it landed in the room with a weight that made her hands still on the books. "Yes," she said, looking up. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands, looking at her with the full, honest weight of his dark eyes, and she could see, quite clearly, that he was being careful not because he was uncertain of himself, but because he was being careful of her. "I'm not going to say anything that you are not ready to hear," he said. "But I would like you to know, if you do not already, that I have been grateful every day since September of last year that you stepped off that coach, and that my interest in your good opinion and your company is not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp threw soft shadows across the room. "It has been an interesting 8 months, she said. "It has," he said. "Cole," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like something she had been holding back for a long time, and releasing it felt like exhaling. "Came here with very specific intentions." "I know," he said. "And they were the right intentions," she said. "The teaching, the work, all of it. I'm not sorry for any of it." "I know that too," he said. "But," she said, and the word had weight, "I have been, somewhat against my better initial planning, finding that the intentions have expanded to include more than I anticipated." He went very still in the way he went still when something was important. "I am telling you," she said, more directly because she had never in her life been good at circling what she meant, "that have developed a significant regard for you, and that if you wanted to, for example, come calling in an official way, would not be opposed to it." The silence that followed was about 3 seconds long, and then Cole Harding smiled, fully and without reservation, and it rearranged his face into something she realized she had been wanting to see in that completeness for months. "Miss Callahan," he said, "nothing in this world would give me more satisfaction." "Good," she said. "Now go home because it is 10 o'clock and I have 20 arithmetic papers to mark before tomorrow." He laughed, an actual full laugh, and she felt it in her chest like the first notes of a familiar song. He went home. She marked her arithmetic papers with a degree of efficiency that was somewhat undermined by the fact that she was smiling through most of them. He came calling that Sunday afternoon formally, in the sense that he arrived at the boarding house in his better shirt and with his hat in his hand and asked Mrs. Pettifer if Miss Callahan was available for a walk, and Mrs. Pettifer said she certainly thought she was, with a composure that fooled absolutely no one. They walked along the creek road, which in October was lined with cottonwoods turning gold, their leaves catching the light and releasing it in flickering patterns across the water. Nora wore her green dress again, which was becoming its own kind of statement that neither of them acknowledged directly. They talked differently now. There was the same quality of easy honesty that had always been between them, but there was less management of distance, less caution in what they allowed to show. He told her about his years working cattle in the Panhandle, and she told him about her college years in San Antonio, the women professors who had shaped her thinking, the arguments she had made in favor of women's professional education that had been controversial even in those relatively progressive corridors. He listened to this with the same level, genuine attention he gave to everything, and she found herself saying things she had not said aloud to anyone in a long time, thoughts about what was fair and what was not, about the particular frustration of being capable and competent, and still having to prove it repeatedly in every new room to every new set of eyes. "It is exhausting," she said, not bitterly, just honestly. "I imagine it is," he said, with a simplicity that acknowledged the reality without minimizing it or trying to fix it, and she appreciated that more than any of the more elaborate responses she had received from men who meant well. "I should tell you," she said, "something that bears on this, I think." He looked at her. "I have always known that I would not give up my work for a marriage," she said. "That has been consistent in me from a young age. My mother worked. She ran the household and the books for my father's business, and she was the best mind in any room she entered. And then she married and the work became invisible and the room became smaller. I loved my father and he loved her, but I watched that, what happened to her capacity, how it narrowed. Do not want that." He was quiet for a moment, the creek moving beside them, the cottonwood leaves drifting down around them in the gentle October air. "Nora," he said, "I would not ask you to give up your work. Not for me, not for anything. What you are doing at that school is necessary. What you have built in this town is real. A man who would ask you to walk away from that would be asking you to be smaller than you are, and that would be a waste of something remarkable." She stopped walking and looked at him, quite directly. "You mean that?" she said. "I mean every word of it," he said. She believed him. Not because she was naive, she was not naive. She was possibly the least naive person she knew, but because she had been watching this man for 8 months in the laboratory of daily life, where character shows itself unguardedly and repeatedly, and everything she had seen had been consistent. He was the same man in the jail talking to a prisoner as he was on the hill on Sunday morning, as he was in the reading club, as he was now on this creek road in October. She reached out and took his hand, which she had not done before, and he closed his fingers around hers with a gentleness that was also strength, and they walked on in the gold cottonwood afternoon. By November, they were the subject of the kind of town attention that Nora found simultaneously entertaining and irrelevant. Mrs. Pettifer did not try very hard to hide her satisfaction. Several of the school mothers mentioned, in the careful, sidelong way of women who are trying to be tactful about being interested, how well Cole Harding was looking lately. Del Sorrento said nothing directly to Nora, but thanked Cole for something in her presence in a way that included them both, which she found sweetly transparent. Garrett Wade had left the county entirely by now, following the widow north to where she had family, and no one seemed to find this loss particularly devastating. The reading club had grown to 11 members and had worked through 2 novels and a collection of essays, and was currently engaged in a heated 3-week discussion about the essays that showed no sign of resolving itself, which Nora considered a success. Rosario Sorrento, by November, was reading English with a fluency that still surprised the other children slightly, and that Nora found a source of deep personal pride. The girl's intelligence was not only real but disciplined, the kind that attaches itself to information with joyful seriousness and does not let go until it has understood the thing completely. Nora had written a letter to the county school board in October recommending that Rosario be considered for the county secondary school scholarship the following year, and the letter had been detailed and forceful, and she had made a copy to keep, because she thought it might be the best letter she had ever written. November also brought a frost that coated the limestone and the cedar branches in the mornings with a delicate white that was gone by 9 and back by the following dawn. The hill walks became more brisk and Nora wore her heavier coat, and the world contracted somewhat from its summer openness into the particular intimacy of shared warmth. Cole brought her a scarf from the general store, a deep blue wool one that he held out to her one Sunday morning, with the straightforward statement that the color had reminded him of something she had once said about the winter sky, and she put it on and wore it for the rest of the walk, and for most of the winter afterward. In December, the schoolroom became something extraordinary. Nora had organized the children to prepare a Christmas program for the town, which was partly a display of what they had learned over the year and partly a celebration, and she put as much of herself into it as she had into anything, because she wanted the town to see what these children were, what they had become with proper attention and adequate materials and a teacher who believed in them completely. They performed on a Saturday evening 2 weeks before Christmas. Every family in the area came. The schoolroom was full beyond its comfortable capacity, people standing along the walls and leaning in the windows, and the children sang and recited and demonstrated mathematics and history, and Lucy Whitmore read a passage from a novel aloud in a voice that was clear and confident, and a world away from the halting child who had stood at the front of the class in March, and Billy Oakes, who 6 months ago had not been able to read a full page, stood up and read a poem he had partly written himself, and there was a silence in the room afterward that was the specific kind of silence that comes when a thing that was good has just happened, and everyone present knows it. Nora stood at the back of the room with her hands clasped and watched the faces of the parents watching their children, and she felt, all the way down to the roots of herself, that this was exactly right. This was the purpose, the whole breathing purpose of what she did and why she did it. Cole was at the back of the room too, standing nearby, and he did not say anything because he understood that there was nothing that needed saying, and his hand found hers in the lamplight crowd and held it, and she let it. After the crowd had gone and the children had been collected by their families, and the schoolroom had been tidied, she and Cole walked home together through the December night, which was cold and clear and full of stars in a way that the Texas sky in winter seems to manage with particular extravagance. He walked her to the boarding house door and they stood on the porch in the cold, and she looked at the stars, and then at him, and the year was almost over, and she thought about who she had been when she stepped off the stagecoach into this red dust town, and who she was standing here now. "Cole," she said. "Yes," he said. She took a breath of cold December air. "I am in love with you," she said, with the direct simplicity that was the only way she knew how to say the true things. "I think I have been for quite some time, and I thought you should know it clearly." He looked at her in the lamplight from the window, and his expression was everything. It was the careful man and the feeling man and the patient man and the true man all at once, and he said quietly, "Nora Callahan, Have been in love with you since about April." She laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her. "April," she said. "The day you told me about Billy Oakes," he said, "that he was frightened rather than bad. I thought, this woman sees the world rightly." She stepped forward and kissed him, because she had been thinking about it for 3 months, and the cold night and the star-filled sky and the December porch seemed like an entirely appropriate moment. And he kissed her back with all that careful steadiness directed into something that was not careful in the least, and the cold did not feel cold for a while. She was 24 years old on the porch of a boarding house in Redrock, Texas, in December of 1882, and she was kissing a man she had told herself 9 months ago she was absolutely not in any way, shape, or circumstance interested in, and she was happier than she had been in years. He asked her to marry him in February, on the Sunday Hill, on the limestone outcropping where they had first encountered each other, which she thought was either entirely unplanned or entirely planned, and she was not sure which possibility was more characteristic of him. He was earnest and direct about it, sitting on the limestone beside her, looking at her rather than at the view for once, and he said that he knew her work was her own and her life was her own, and he was not asking her to give up any part of herself, only to let him be part of the life she was already living, and that he thought they would be good for each other for a very long time. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the view, the Texas country spreading south in the February light, clean and bare and beautiful. "Yes," she said. "Yes." He said, "That is what I said," she said, and she was smiling, and so was he, and the hill country was wide and bright around them, and a red-tailed hawk was riding the thermals in slow circles above the limestone ridge. They were married in March of 1883, exactly 1 year after Nora had stepped off the stagecoach, in the church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, which seemed entirely appropriate. Mrs. Pettifer cried in the way of women who have been quietly invested in an outcome for a long time and feel entitled to some emotional acknowledgement of having been right. Del Sorrento and his sister Rosario were both there, and Lucy Whitmore's family, and Billy Oakes, who stood very straight in his good shirt, and essentially everyone in and around Redrock, because Cole Harding was the kind of man a whole town shows up for, and Nora Callahan was the kind of woman a whole town had come to understand it needed. Her father came from San Antonio on the train, walking with his stick but steady, and he held her hands before the ceremony and looked at her the way he used to look at her mother, with a love that was also a kind of reverence, and he said, "Your mother would have been proud of you, not for the wedding, for all of it." She kept her teaching certificate. She kept her name professionally, Miss Callahan, to the children, though at home and in the town she was Nora Harding to most people after a time, and she found she did not mind the name because she had chosen it rather than having it settled on her. She taught that year and the next and the year after that, because there was never a question about that. Cole understood it completely, having always understood it, and he spent his evenings in the sheriff's office or at home with her, and their life had the texture of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's days, which is not a small or common thing. They moved into Cole's house, which was on the west side of town and had a good porch and 2 live oak trees in the yard, and Nora painted the front door a particular blue that she had been thinking about for a while, and planted a kitchen garden in the side yard that became, in subsequent years, one of the best kitchen gardens in Redrock, a fact she was quietly but fully pleased about. In the summer of 1884, their son was born. They named him James William Harding, James for her father and William because Cole's father had been William, and he was a round, forceful, opinionated baby from the first hour of his life, and grew into a round, forceful, opinionated child who exhausted everyone who was not his mother, who found his energy familiar and channeled it with the same patient, firm, purposeful approach she brought to everything else. Rosario Sorrento won the county secondary school scholarship in 1884 and wrote Nora a letter from her school in the city that was so full of joy and intelligent observation that Nora read it aloud at the next reading club meeting. And there was not a dry eye in the room, including, though he would not admit it easily, Del Sorrento, who had come to the reading club regularly by now and was working his farm with the techniques from the borrowed book and doing well. Billy Oakes finished the school program in 1885 at 14, with a reading level that astonished the county inspector, and a certificate that was the first in his family. He told Nora on the last day of school that he wanted to be a schoolteacher himself someday, and she told him she thought that was an excellent idea and that he should write to her when he had his certificate. In 1886, their daughter was born. They named her Clara Mee Harding, and she came into the world with a disposition so serene and sunny that her older brother regarded her with fascinated suspicion for the first 6 months, uncertain what to make of a small person who did not seem to share his urgent relationship with existence. The tensions between the ranching operations and the farming community did not disappear, because the deep economic and land conflicts of the era did not resolve themselves easily, but they became more managed, partly because Cole Harding was extremely good at being sheriff and partly because the community had built enough connective tissue, through reading clubs and school programs and harvest gatherings, and the general human tendency to become invested in each other's children, that the antagonism had somewhere else to go besides direct confrontation. Beaumont and Cole reached, over the years, something not quite a friendship but a working respect, the kind that develops between men who disagree substantially but have established that they will deal with each other honestly. This was more than most people managed, and Nora considered it a significant achievement. The town grew in the following years, not dramatically. This was never going to be a city, but steadily, with 2 new families arriving in 1885, and a small mill being established on the creek in 1887 that created work and made the community more economically complex and less dependent on the single volatile variable of cattle prices. The school needed a second teacher by 1887, and Nora oversaw the hiring with a thoroughness that made the school board slightly nervous, and the eventual candidate, a young woman named Eleanor from Fort Worth, entirely clear about what was expected. Nora's father visited twice more in those years, and each time he looked at her life and at her husband, and at his grandchildren, and at the town, and at his daughter moving through all of it with the particular conviction and capability that he had watched growing in her since she was small, and he was satisfied in the deepest way a parent can be satisfied, which is not because your child followed the path you imagined, but because they found the path that was genuinely theirs. On the evening of the 6th anniversary of their wedding, March of 1889, Nora and Cole sat on the front porch of their house in the last light, Clara on Nora's lap mostly asleep, and James somewhere in the yard making the sounds of a boy engaged in a project that probably required supervision, the 2 live oaks casting their lengthening evening shadows across the yard and the blue door catching the last of the sun. "Should tell you something," Nora said. "Yes," Cole said. "There is going to be another one," she said. He looked at her, taking it in, and then the smile came, that full, unreserved smile that she had been the first to ever call fully from him, 7 years ago in the parlor of Mrs. Pettifer's boarding house on an October evening. "Is that so?" he said. "That is so," she said. James appeared from the side of the house with what appeared to be a stick and a very complicated theory about something, and Cole handled this with the calm patience of a man who has been dealing with James's theories for 5 years and has learned to listen first and redirect. Second, and Clara stirred on Nora's lap and made a sound that might have been a word or might have been the dream of one, and the evening went on around them the way evenings go in hill country Texas, slowly and with depth, the light taking a long time to go. Nora looked at the yard and the oaks and the blue door, and the street of the town beyond the fence where she could see, if she looked, the corner of the schoolhouse roof. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with her carpet bag and her convictions and her armor, who had made her announcement to a patient man in a dusty street and received 2 words and a wait. And she thought about what those 2 words had meant, and how they had been truer than anything she might have doubted at the time. And she thought about how the life she had built here was the one she had come to build, her work, her school, her children growing in the Texas air. And also this man on the porch beside her who had never asked her to be smaller and had simply waited, steadily and without complaint, for her to see what she was already becoming. She had come here to work, and she had worked, fully and completely, and it turned out that love, the right kind of love, the kind that does not demand your smaller self but makes room for your largest one, had not required her to give up a single inch of what she was. She reached over and took Cole's hand on the arm of his chair, and he looked at her over James's ongoing theory, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was 7 years of daily life, of honesty and patience and shared hills and shared reading clubs and a cracked blackboard and a harvest dance and 1,000 suppers and 2 children, and another coming, and all of it, every single ordinary extraordinary day of it, held in the look between them in the evening light. The 3rd child, born in October of 1889, was another boy. They named him Thomas after Cole's grandfather, and he had his mother's eyes and his father's patience, and James could not have been more delighted by the arrival of someone he could eventually supervise. And Clara presided over the new baby with the seriousness of a 5-year-old who has considered the question of siblings and reached a favorable conclusion. The autumn that year was warm and golden, and on Sunday mornings Nora and Cole walked the hill road with the children, James running ahead and Clara holding Nora's hand and young Thomas in Cole's arms. And the mockingbirds still sang their wild catalog in the cedars, and the red-tailed hawk still rode the thermals above the limestone ridge, and the Texas country spread out in all directions under a sky so deep and wide it felt like a gift. Nora stood on the limestone outcropping where she had first bumped into a patient man one May morning 7 years before, and she held Clara's hand and looked at the view and thought that she had been entirely right, coming here, and entirely right in everything she had said on that first day, and that somehow, impossibly, being entirely right had not prevented her from also finding this life that was more than she had been trying for. She had come here to work. She had worked. And everything else, the hills and the dance and the blue door and the scarf and the reading club and the children, and the man who stood beside her holding their youngest son with his hat slightly pushed back by the October wind, all of it had grown from that root, from the work, from the purpose, from the woman who had known herself completely and had simply been entirely herself. She thought her mother would have liked it here. She thought her mother would have liked the school and the reading club and the kitchen garden and the view from the hill. She thought her mother would have recognized in Cole Harding the particular kind of man worth having, the kind that makes you larger rather than smaller, that stands next to you rather than in front of you, that says yes ma'am and means it in the fullest and most respectful sense, not submission but acknowledgement. I see you, I hear you, am not going anywhere. James came racing back from the far end of the trail to report something urgent about a rabbit he had seen, and Cole handed Thomas to Nora and knelt down to listen to James with his complete attention, and Clara leaned against Nora's leg and looked at the view, and October moved through the cedars warm and golden. And the town of Redrock lay below them in the afternoon light, small and stubborn and entirely real, and the school stood on its corner with its good blackboard and its lending library, and its next generation of children learning the things that would carry them forward, and everything that needed to be was where it needed to be. This was the life. It was good, and it was hers, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. It was everything.